We're going to talk for a little while today about 2 Corinthians 12. And we were talking last time about this fascinating portion of Scripture where Paul says he was going to boast about the revelations that God gave him. In fact, down in verse 7, he says to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations. So, if you're comparing Paul to these false teachers, if you're comparing Paul even to the other apostles, nobody could say that they had had any greater revelations from God than Paul. And his point is that he is an apostle and that they need to listen to what he's telling them. But it was interesting to me, the study of the third heaven and paradise. But then he said God afflicted him with this thorn in the flesh, or allowed Satan to afflict him with this thorn in the flesh, which is interesting to me because Satan does things to people. People suffer because of Satan. Satan tries to derail people's faith by making them suffer in this way or that way. But people will say, yes, but God allows it. That's true. But God allows free will. He allows the angels free will, and he allowed Satan free will, and he allows people free will. So Satan touches us, but sometimes God uses even the things that Satan does in order to help us, which he did with Paul. Help Paul from being conceited, make him more humble. Verse 9, God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. So God wanted Paul to be a little bit weak so that he would be a little bit more humble, so that he would trust more in the power of God. And so he says in verse 10, that is why for Christ's sake I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, and in trouble. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What he means is God really works through me more powerfully when I'm weak, because I trust God more. This theme in Corinthians goes all the way back. If you go to 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 and 9, there Paul was talking about his affliction which he endured in Asia, in Ephesus. 2 Corinthians 1, 8 and 9. Brother Aaron, how about reading that for us if you got it?
You said chapter 1, verse 8 and 9?
Yes.
Sorry, just one moment. Got stuck in 1 Corinthians.
Technical difficulties. Is this a computer or an actual Bible you're reading?
No, this is a computer. I don't have my actual Bible out.
That's too bad.
Okay. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia. Then, that we were burdened excessively, beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead.
All right, that last part. So that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead. So Paul was at his very weakest. Then he trusted more in God, and that's true of all of us. God uses our weakness to get us to trust in him. So, having said all of that, back in chapter 12, verse 11, Paul says, I've become a fool. I've made a fool of myself, and you drove me to it. This word that he uses where it says, you drove me to it, do some of you have, you forced me to do it, or you compelled me to do it?
Compelled is the American Standard.
All right, compelled is good because it is actually the word anagkadzo, like you have in Galatians, that they were compelling or forcing people to be circumcised. It's really the same word here. So you forced me to it. You by your continual referring to these other guys and And you forced me to compare myself with these guys. You know, Paul says I've made a fool of myself because back in chapter 12, verse 10, he says, we do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves. They are without understanding. Well, but Paul eventually gets dragged into doing that because the Corinthians seem to be listening to these other guys. So he says, I've made a fool out of myself. You forced me to it. I ought to have been commended by you. See, this word commended is throughout the book of, or commend, or recommend, is throughout the book of 2 Corinthians, as far back as chapter 3, verse 1, where he says, do I need letters of commendation or recommendation like these guys? So, again, we come back to this. What is it that commends us as ministers of Christ? And basically, in Paul's book, it's our own conduct. It's our own behavior. It's our own teaching, our own track record with people that commends us to them. It's interesting here that, you know, nobody here hardly ever thinks of the fact that I've got a PhD. They hardly ever even let that enter their mind. That doesn't register with them because I'm just Dan, you know. But now if I go somewhere else, I get all this, okay, you know, you're a doctor or some kind, you know. Oh, really? I forgot. Seriously? But it's like in this church, I'm just plain old Dan that's been here forever. And Paul was like that. You know, his credibility was not based on the fact that he'd studied with Gamaliel or whatever it was. It was his track record with the actual people. So he says, I ought to have been commended by you, but I am not in the least inferior to those. Literally, I do not lack anything. I'm not lacking in comparison to the super apostles, the most excellent apostles, even though I'm nothing. Now see, the most excellent apostles, the super apostles, that's Paul being sarcastic. Because I think he means that in the minds of some people, like Peter and James and John, were like the super apostles. I mean, they were Jesus' favorites. They went up the mountain with Jesus. They were there on Pentecost. Paul was not. They were the big dogs. Even, you know, they were the Jerusalem apostles. But Paul says, I'm not inferior to them. Maybe the false teachers were comparing Paul to the super apostles and saying that he didn't measure up. And then Paul says, the signs of an apostle, verse 12, were worked among you with all perseverance, both signs and wonders and miracles. Signs and wonders are the words used in Joel's prophecy, Joel chapter 2. And evidently being an apostle, or the veracity of being an apostle, the proof of being an apostle, had to do with the ability to work great signs and wonders. And Paul could do it. The other apostles could do it. And so he mentions the signs of an apostle were done among you. Now, if you go back to 1 Corinthians, again, chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3. Excuse me, not verse 3, verse 4. He says, my preaching, or my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power. So the demonstration of the Spirit and power, I think, is the signs and wonders that Paul's talking about. And he says, so that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So Paul's apostleship, his message was confirmed by the demonstration of the Spirit and power in miracles and signs and wonders. So you may have ABC to say about Paul, but Paul is a genuine apostle. And so you ought to look at and listen to him in that way. So Paul makes that quite clear. I think that basically in Mark 16:20, they went forth and preached everywhere, the Lord also working with them, confirming the word with signs that followed. I think that's basically talking about the apostles and how God confirmed the message of the apostles by those miracles. And if you read, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, that seems to be basically referring to the apostles as well. Let's look at that real quick. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. He's comparing in Hebrews 2 the Old Testament revelation through Moses to the New Testament revelation through the apostles. Verse 3, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3. How shall we as opposed to them back in the Old Testament, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation, which at first was spoken by the Lord? That's Jesus. See, it was at first spoken by the Lord. Now watch this. And afterward it was confirmed to us by those that heard him. So you've got the Lord, which is Jesus, and us, that's the writer of Hebrews and the Hebrews. And then you've got those who heard the Lord. That's the apostles. See? So let's run back through that one more time. Verse 3. Hebrews 2. How shall we that are writing and reading the book of Hebrews, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation, which was at the beginning spoken to us by the Lord, see, and was confirmed to us by those, or them, that heard him. So there you have the apostles confirming the word to other people by the miracles and signs of an apostle, which they worked. Which also puts the writer of Hebrews outside of the group of the apostles. See? All right, so anyway, the apostles had unique abilities. And it's not that somebody else couldn't work a miracle or something like that if they had the gift of miracles, but there was something about the signs of an apostle which set them apart and confirmed the word that was revealed to the apostles. And 2 Corinthians 12:12 says that Paul was in that category of people that were able to do those things. Okay? So, back to 2 Corinthians. He said, I'm not inferior to those other apostles. I have worked among you, Corinthians, the signs of an apostle with all patience. And he says, how were you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden unto you? Forgive me this wrong. See, the only difference in the way I treated you Corinthians than other churches is I never was a burden to you. I never depended upon you for financial assistance. Forgive me this wrong. And the reason I think he says this is because the false teachers were using that against Paul to say that Paul must not be worth very much if he didn't charge you any money. So you get what you pay for. So he says, forgive me this wrong. Look back at chapter 11, verses 7 through 10, where he made the same argument back in chapter 11. Read me 11, 7 through 10 there. Brother Ron, do you have it by any chance?
Where are we at?
11, 7 through 10.
11, 7 through 10, 2 Corinthians?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supported my need, and in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you, and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia.
All right, very good. So, again, Paul repeats the idea that, I'm sorry, you're holding against me that I didn't charge you any money, but I didn't, and I'm not going to. Look down at verse 14. He says, now I'm ready to visit you for the third time, and I will not be a burden to you. And this is the classic line, because what I want is you and not your possessions. What I'm after is you, not what you have. I'm not after your money. I'm not after your possessions. I'm after you. I'm after souls. And there was really nothing they could say about that. Now, let's stop in a practical way and talk about this matter of the preacher being supported by people. Again, the Bible teaches that that's a good thing and that it should be that way. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 15 and 16 says, those that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And that's not a problem. But I will tell you that there are people in the church who will always have feelings about that, negative feelings about that. It's just the nature of human beings. Some people will have the notion in their heads that preachers don't do anything, and so they're not worth supporting. That's another reason why you need to make it quite obvious to the leadership and to the church that you are doing things, you are active, and that helps with that. Sometimes if it gets to the point where you're being supported to a level that's greater than some of the people in the church, some people in the church will resent you for making more money than they do. It's just the nature of the beast. But the more you're actively doing things and people can see that you're working hard and trying, the less of an issue that will be. Okay, so I'm just saying that sometimes that is going to be an issue. But Paul showed them that, supported or not, he was interested in their souls. Some people have the notion that it's wrong to support a preacher. And they call preachers who receive support hirelings. Have you ever heard that?
Yep.
They call them hirelings, meaning they wouldn't do it if they weren't supported. Of course, Paul tells here and other places about the Macedonians. And if you go back to 1 Corinthians for a minute, just go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He mentions that he and Barnabas had the right to support, but in Corinth they didn't use that right. Look at 1 Corinthians 9, verse 6. He said, is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of the fruits of it? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of it? Verse 9, it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while he's threshing. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us. Because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. But drop down to the middle of verse 12. Verse 12, starting at the beginning. If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. Look down at verse 14. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. They should receive their living from the gospel. So it's good and right for the preacher to be supported. But even though that's true, from a practical standpoint, I'm telling you that in your life as a minister, some people will resent you for it. How do you combat that? You combat that by being a diligent worker, open and obviously busy at what you do. If you sleep till noon every day and are rarely ever seen at the office and nobody knows what you're doing, people will resent you big time for your receiving support. But if you're obviously working and you're obviously busy, most people will be happy to support you. Except for one or two hardheads. Okay. Now, when eldership supports their preacher vocally, that takes care of most of that. All right, so then go down to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14, in the middle where Paul says, what I want is not you, not your possessions, but you. Then he says, after all, children should not save up for their parents, but parents for their children. It seems to me that Paul is going back to the fact that he is their father in the gospel. And if you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15 and 16, actually verse 14 and 15, 1 Corinthians 4, 14 and 15. Brother Ben, is there a chance that you may have this passage for us?
Verse 15.
14 and 15.
I do not, 1 Corinthians 4:14. I do not write these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For if you were to have countless tutors in Christ, yet you would not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I became your father through the gospel.
There you go. So I am your spiritual father. I brought you to Christ. I'm the one that converted you to Jesus Christ. I'm your spiritual father. So he thought of them that way as his children. And, of course, he's mentioned this before. They weren't loving him back like he really loves them. So verse 15, just like with children, we're back to chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, verse 15. He says, so I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you all the more, will you love me less? See, if there's nothing you wouldn't do for your children, there's nothing you wouldn't spend for your children. But Paul says, I will spend my own money and I will be spent personally, emotionally, for your souls. Paul was the real deal. He was willing to do what it took in pursuing their souls. Even so, even with that attitude, they didn't seem to have the same dedication to Paul that he had for him, or he had for them, which was at times hurtful to Paul. Just a second. Okay, so you come down here to verse 16 where Paul says, I will gladly spend and be spent for your souls. And by the way, the verse 15 is where he says that. You've got to be willing to do some of that even for the souls of people. Be that as it may, he says, I have not been a burden to you, yet crafty fellow that I am, I have caught you by trickery. He's being sarcastic. He realizes that Paul did not use trickery. He did not do anything but be straightforward with these people from the very beginning. And they know it. And he knows that they know it. And so he's coming back to that. And then he says in verse 17, did I exploit you through any of the men I sent you? Have I myself or anybody I've ever sent you tried to exploit you? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. He knows the answer to that is no. Verse 18, I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Now, when he says, I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him, I go back to chapter 8, verse 18. After he said Titus was coming to them, chapter 8, verse 18. And we are sending along with him, along with Titus, the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service in the gospel. That's 8:18. 8:18. So I think Paul is talking about that same brother here in chapter 12, verse 18, where he says, I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? See, that's another rhetorical question. No, Titus did not exploit them. So Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not act in the same spirit and follow the same course? Paul knows the answer to that. He knows that the answer to that is yes. And the fact that the Corinthians knew the answer to that was a strong indication of Paul's credibility. Okay? This is another reason when we speak practically about preaching, that you cannot, aside from collecting your support from the church, you cannot get into any money-making schemes where you're asking church members to give you money, to buy things from you, selling things to them, because that leaves them the impression that you're not just there for their spiritual interest, that you want to make money off of them. You want to exploit them. So please avoid that if you possibly can. And if you're going to get into any side businesses, do that business with somebody besides members of the church so that they can't say that to you. They have to believe that your motives are pure when you come to them and that you only want what is good for them. And Paul feels bad about even having to say these things, but as he says back in verse 11, you know, they kind of forced him to it by comparing him with these false teachers. Verse 19, he says, have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? We have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ. And everything we do, beloved, is for your strengthening. In other words, I'm trying to get you people to see something that's true by making these comparisons. And everything we do, including this, it's for your strengthening. For your building up, for your edification. How do you have it translated? For your upbuilding. All right? For your upbuilding. A little bit earlier, if you go back to chapter 10, verse 8, there Paul says, for even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than pulling you down. So he mentions several times that the authority God gave him was for building people up spiritually, for helping them spiritually, not hurting them. And so, you know, he says, everything I'm doing is for your strengthening. Now, I want you to underline something here. In verse 20, I want you to underline the word, I am afraid. I am afraid. And then in verse 21, let's see here. How do you have verse 21 beginning translated?
I am afraid.
Okay, I've got that too. So I am afraid. And then, let's see here. How about, let's see, in the middle of verse 20, I'm wondering if it's 3 times here and not 2 times. And he's already said it, like back, if you go all the way back to chapter 11 and verse 3, he said, I am afraid, lest by any means as the serpent deceived Eve in his craftiness, your mind should be corrupted from the purity and simplicity of the toward Christ. So Paul was afraid for the souls of these people. And he repeats, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid. Now, are you ever afraid for your children? Yes. And I am afraid for my children. And I tell them from time to time that I'm afraid for them. That seems to communicate well to them. Sometimes when I get sort of raise my voice, it's because I'm afraid. But you know, we are protective of those that we love, and Paul was protective of his children. He says, "For I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be." See, he wrote this other letter, and they'd complied with these things, and he was glad. But he didn't want to find them again led astray and in a situation that he didn't want them to be in. He wanted to find them in a better state when he finally came again. So he says, I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. See, they would want Paul to be in a good mood and gentle and kind and everything, and if he was having to get on to them, that wouldn't be good for Paul or for them. He said, I'm afraid that there may be quarreling and jealousy, and I'm afraid that there might be strife and jealousy and shouting or anger, factions and blasphemy or evil speaking, gossip. People being puffed up. See, disorderliness. I'm afraid that when I come again, my God will humble me before you. In other words, that he'll have to be in a negative vein, getting on to them and correcting them. And I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of their uncleanness and fornication and immorality which they have practiced. So Paul wants things to be good when he comes to Corinth again. But he's afraid that maybe they're not going to be again, and he's worried about that. Another day in the life of a sincere evangelist. Yes, Brother Jeremiah.
So is it fair to look at his behavior here in these passages? It's like Paul just has this pure motivation that it's all for their good. His goals of positive progress is for their good. His fears are a concern over their good.
That's right.
So you could call that a pure motivation.
Yes. And he's also hurt personally because he does have this parental, protective, pure motivation for the good of their souls, and yet he's hurt that they don't return the kind of care that he has for them back to him. He's still a human being. See, us preachers are still human beings. We are human, and we have human emotions, and we're challenged to keep those emotions in check and to behave ourselves in the right way. We get hurt, we get angry, we get sad, we get discouraged just like everybody else does. But we're supposed to keep going in a positive way amid those things. And 2 Corinthians is a great example of an apostle who's just a human being, and he's trying as hard as he can to be like he's supposed to be, but these people are making him crazy. So that's part of it. People are not easy things to deal with. Sometimes people are the greatest joy, and sometimes they can be the greatest pain. That's just the way it is. All right, so in chapter 13, verse 1, Paul says, "This will be my third visit to you." Now, if you go back to chapter 12, verse 14, he says, "Now I am ready to visit you for the third time." So 12:14 and 13:1, he says, "I'm about to come see you for the third time." And he's already said, "I'm not going to be a burden to you." And then he said, "I'm afraid that it's not going to be a pleasant visit like I wanted it to be." Remember back in chapter 2, he said, "I don't want to come to you with sorrow anymore. That's why I didn't come right away." So he says, "This will be my third visit to you." Chapter 13, verse 1. "Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." Now, let's look at some passages here. First, let's look at Deuteronomy 19:15. Brother Carl, if you would look this up. Deuteronomy 19:15. And then we want to get Brother Clayton to look up Matthew 18:15 through 18. And then we want Adam, the little dark glasses, warns, to look up 1 Timothy 5, verse 19. Now let's get the first one, Brother Carl Pollard, to read Deuteronomy 19:15.
"One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established."
All right, Deuteronomy 19:15. Now let's get Clayton, I think, to read Matthew 18:15 through 18.
"If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 with you, so that by the mouth of 1 or 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven."
One more or two. Keep going.
"Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about everything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their mindset."
All right, so those 2 or 3 that are gathered together, if you go back up in the passage there, are the 2 or 3 that are the witnesses when you go to reconcile the sinful brother. And so what are they gathered together for? They're gathered together to reconcile a brother that has sinned. That's not talking about church at the lake, where there's 2 families that have decided to go to the lake on Sunday instead of going to church, and they use where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there am I. No, that's not about that. That's about when 2 or 3 of us go to reconcile a brother that has sinned so that we might have 2 or 3 witnesses. Then where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am in the midst of them. In other words, I am supportive, says Jesus, of your efforts to reconcile a brother that has sinned. Has nothing to do with church at the lake. Okay? Now go to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 19. Brother Adam Warrens.
Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses.
Read one more.
Those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also will be fearful of sinning.
All right, so if I'm going to receive an accusation against an elder, I need to do it at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. So that means that somebody must have already gone to the elder personally, and then they must have already taken their 2 or 3 witnesses, and now I'm going to, as the evangelist of the church, hear from those 2 or 3 witnesses that yes, he really has a problem, and yes, we've already been through the first 2 steps of Matthew 18. Okay? So this business of the 2 or 3 witnesses is established several places in Scripture. And so here Paul says, it's going to be my 3rd visit to you in 2 Corinthians 13:1. And every matter, if I hear people saying that this has been going on or this is going to be going on, we're going to establish it at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. We're going to make sure that it's true and that we've got people that say it's true. And then we're going to deal with it the way it's supposed to be dealt with. Interesting, huh? So let's talk for a few minutes practically about confronting issues in the church and how we do that in the proper way. Somebody comes to you and they're telling you that there's a problem with brother so-and-so, or there's a problem with sister so-and-so, and there's this bad thing going on. And you say, well, let's go then, you and I, the person that comes to see you with it, let's go visit brother so-and-so or brother sister so-and-so, and we'll talk about this. Now, a lot of time they'll say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. And you can say, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell them that you came to me, so you might as well come with me. And let's go. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut down a whole lot of gossip, but you're also going to directly go before things get to festering, and you're going to confront some issues. You know, so-and-so's telling me this. I want to come see about you. What's going on? How can we help you? A lot of times you'll end up resolving it right there. It'll be resolved. You'll pray about it. It'll be okay. You know, sometimes there'll be defiance. Yes, that's a problem, but I'm not ready to do anything about it. Your next step may be to go encourage them with 1 or 2 of the elders or something like that. But the quicker you confront it directly, the better things are going to be, especially if you confront it in gentleness and love and you want to help and everything. You don't let gossip go. And if somebody comes to you and they don't want to go, say, well, then don't come to me and tell me something if you don't want to go, because I'm now going to go talk to this person. So that will help people know that you do things in the right way. Now I'm going to turn off the recorder again.